In July of 2026, roughly 5.3 million people were actively gaming on Linux through Steam in a single month, a platform that barely registered as a rounding error 3 years earlier. And just 4 months before that, Windows dropped below 93% of the same audience for the first time in the history of Valve's hardware survey. Something structural is happening underneath the world's most dominant gaming platform, and it did not happen by accident. For most of the last 2 decades, Linux gaming was a punchline, not a plan. Drivers were unreliable, publishers didn't bother porting their engines, and anti-cheat software simply refused to run outside of Windows. If you wanted to play a modern game on release day, Windows wasn't a preference, it was a requirement. That baseline held so firmly for so long that Valve's own monthly Steam hardware and software survey, which tracks the operating systems real players use, showed Linux stuck near 1% to 2% for years on end. Valve itself tried to break that pattern once before, back in 2013 with an earlier generation of Steam machines built around Linux. That first attempt landed on an unfinished compatibility layer and a thin game library, and it quietly failed. Understanding why the number is moving now, more than a decade later, means understanding 2 separate stories that collided at the same moment. What Microsoft did to its own operating system, and what Valve quietly finished building underneath everyone's feet. The first story starts with a deadline. On October 14, 2025, Microsoft ended official support for Windows 10, cutting off security patches for an operating system that, at the time, was still running on an estimated 500 million personal computers. That is not a small technical footnote. It means 500 million machines were suddenly one unpatched vulnerability away from being a liability, with no more fixes coming unless their owners did something about it. Microsoft offered a bridge, a paid extended security updates program, later extended to cover devices through October 14, 2026. A Windows Central Reader poll taken after that extension was announced found a clear majority, 68% of respondents, said they'd rather keep running Windows 10 through 2027 than upgrade to Windows 11 at all, which is a striking number for an operating system that had already technically reached its end of life. But a subscription to keep receiving basic security patches is still a bill nobody asked for, and it does nothing to fix the deeper problem for a huge slice of that installed base, which is that their hardware simply cannot run Windows 11 at all. Windows 11 requires a specific security chip, a compatible processor generation, and a handful of other checks that many perfectly functional gaming PCs fail. For a graphics card, you can usually just buy a new one and slot it in. For a processor incompatibility, the fix is a new motherboard, new RAM, and often an entirely new build. One industry analyst covering PC gaming hardware described this as the first time in Windows history that an operating system upgrade required a forced hardware migration that couldn't be solved with a simple component swap. So the choice facing Windows 10 users after October 2025 wasn't really upgrade or don't. It was spend real money on a new system, keep paying for security patches on a dying OS, or find a third option. The first option, staying on Windows 10 through the paid extended security updates program, isn't free, and it isn't a permanent fix either. It only buys time, 1 year at most, under the extended arrangement running through October 2026, and it does nothing for anyone whose real goal is simply to keep gaming on hardware that already works fine. Businesses face a sharper version of the same, math. Compatibility audits from firms tracking enterprise IT found that Windows 11's hardware checks became a genuine budget problem for organizations trying to stretch equipment refresh cycles by even 2 or 3 years, turning what used to be a routine software update into a forced capital expense. None of that is unique to gamers, but it explains why the frustration wasn't confined to hobbyists venting online. It reached IT departments, repair advocates, and right-to-repair groups too, some of whom explicitly argued that pushing hundreds of millions of working machines toward early retirement carried a real environmental cost, from the emissions of manufacturing replacement hardware to the sheer volume of otherwise functional computers heading for landfills. Whether or not you agree with how forcefully that argument was made, it reframed the Windows 11 upgrade from a simple product decision into something people were willing to publicly organize against. That third option had already been organizing itself for months, a grassroots campaign calling itself End of 10, made up partly of people connected to the Linux and KDE open source communities, spent 2025 actively encouraging Windows 10 users to install Linux on their existing hardware instead of buying anything new at all. Their pitch was blunt. The same laptop that Microsoft says can't run, Windows 11 can usually run a modern Linux desktop just fine for free, with years of security support ahead of it. The campaign's public messaging went further than a simple product pitch, accusing Microsoft of a kind of forced obsolescence, arguing that users faced real financial cost and unnecessary environmental waste just to keep receiving basic security updates on hardware that otherwise still worked perfectly well. The Document Foundation, the organization behind the open source LibreOffice suite, published its own detailed breakdown around the same time, arguing what it called the real long-term cost of staying inside the Windows ecosystem. When Windows 10's actual shutdown date arrived, the emotional reaction online was hard to miss. Social media filled with posts eulogizing the operating system, with more than a few of them ending in some version of the same sentence. It's time to install Linux. That's not hard data, but it's a real signal of where public sentiment was sitting at the exact moment the deadline hit. Here's the honest complication in that story, and it matters if you want the full picture instead of a comfortable one. John Petty Research, a firm that specifically tracks PC gaming hardware trends, found that most gamers stranded by the Windows 11 hardware wall weren't switching to Linux at all. According to the firm's senior gaming analyst, the requirement wasn't something a graphics card swap could fix because it demanded a new processor, which in turn meant a new motherboard and usually new memory too. So the dominant pattern was people simply buying new pre-built Windows 11 systems or building new PCs from scratch around fresh components, rather than migrating their existing machine to a different operating system entirely. The same analyst noted that dedicated do-it-yourself gamers were already prepared for exactly that kind of rebuild, often assembling a new Windows 11 machine alongside their aging Windows 10 PC, instead of attempting to patch the old system into compatibility. So the Windows 10 deadline created millions of frustrated users and a wave of public anger. But it didn't single-handedly send them all running to Linux. It created the opening. Something else had to make people actually want to walk through it. That something else was Windows 11 itself, and specifically what Microsoft chose to build into it over the following 2 years. The most damaging single feature was Windows Recall, an AI tool designed to take a screenshot of your screen every few seconds and store it so you could later search your own activity like a photographic memory. When it was first announced, security researchers pointed out that those screenshots were being stored completely unencrypted on the device, meaning anything on your screen at any moment, bank details, private messages, medical information, was sitting in a plain, readable file. The backlash was severe enough that Microsoft delayed the entire feature by more than a year to rebuild its security model from the ground up. The rebuilt version added encryption and required Windows Hello authentication before anyone could open it. That should have closed the story. It didn't. A cybersecurity researcher later demonstrated that malware could still trigger Recall's own legitimate security pop-up, tricking a user into unlocking the vault themselves and handing the malware everything stored inside it. A feature, built specifically to reassure people that their screen activity was safe, ended up becoming a new attack surface for the exact kind of theft it was supposed to prevent. For a channel like this one, that's the difference between a vague privacy complaint and a specific, verifiable failure. It's not that Recall watches you, it's that a locked vault of your screen history for months can be unlocked by tricking one pop-up. To put that in a concrete, illustrative scenario rather than an abstract one, imagine a gamer who streams occasionally, has a banking app open in another window, and logs into a game launcher with saved credentials. Under the original unencrypted version of Recall, all three of those moments would have been captured as a searchable screenshot sitting in plain text on the drive. Even under the corrected, encrypted version, that same person's entire recent history is one tricked authentication pop-up away from being exposed to whatever malware happened to be running at the time. That example isn't describing a specific real victim. It's illustrating what the documented vulnerability actually means in practice for an ordinary daily routine, which is exactly the kind of specific, nameable risk that tends to push someone from mild annoyance toward actively researching alternatives. Recall wasn't an isolated misstep either. It arrived in the middle of a broader pattern that longtime Windows users started calling out by name, one that stretches back further than most people realize. Windows 11 launched in late 2021 with a redesigned interface, rounded corners, and a marketing pitch built entirely around modernization. The friction started building almost immediately after, and it never really stopped. Update KB5.03.6980 in April of 2024 began injecting what Microsoft labeled promoted content directly into the Start menu, the lock screen, File Explorer, and the notification panel of an operating system people had already paid for. Copilot buttons, Microsoft's AI assistant, were added into Snipping Tool, Photos, Notepad, Widgets, File Explorer, and Settings starting in September of 2023, mostly without an easy way to remove them. OneDrive began auto-enabling itself without asking, quietly moving local files into Microsoft's cloud storage, and users who tried disabling it afterward found their local files had simply vanished, only to reappear once the service's free storage limit was hit. And files started getting deleted outright. By October of 2025, Microsoft had closed off the remaining workarounds that once let users set up a Windows 11 PC with a local account instead of a mandatory Microsoft Cloud account. None of these were individually catastrophic, Together, across roughly 4 years since launch, they built a pattern that a growing number of users summarized with a single dismissive nickname, Microslop, an OS that felt engineered around Microsoft's own data and revenue goals, rather than the person sitting in front of the keyboard. Even inside Microsoft, that pattern eventually became impossible to defend publicly. Reporting in early 2026 indicated the company's own Windows leadership acknowledged the operating level of the operating system by design, and Riot Games has built it in a way that is fundamentally incompatible with how Linux handles that kind of access. No official workaround exists. Fortnite carries similar restrictions in several of its competitive modes. So the accurate picture isn't anti-cheat is solved. It's anti-cheat is now a per-game decision instead of a platform-wide impossibility, which is a meaningfully different and much more solvable problem than the one Linux gamers faced 5 years ago. If Proton solved the software problem, the Steam Deck solved the human one. Valve's handheld gaming PC runs on Steam OS, which is itself a version of Linux, and it shipped to an estimated 5.6 million buyers by mid-2025, capturing roughly 48% of the entire tracked handheld gaming PC market in 2024. Here's the part that matters most for this story. Most Steam Deck owners never think of themselves as Linux users at all. They bought a gaming device, turned it on, and played their existing Steam library without ever opening a terminal or installing a driver. Every single one of those devices, though, gets counted as a Linux machine in Valve's monthly hardware survey, because technically it is one. That single product did more to normalize Linux gaming for ordinary, non-technical people than 2 decades of enthusiast advocacy ever managed, simply by removing every reason someone would need to know or care what operating system they were running. The reaction from hardware makers is another concrete signal worth naming, separate from Valve's own devices. Specialist manufacturers like System 76 have continued expanding lines of laptops and desktops that ship with Linux pre-installed out of the box, aimed squarely at people who don't want to install anything themselves. They just want a working machine on day one. That's a small slice of the overall PC market, but it's a meaningfully different starting point than a decade ago, when buying a Linux machine essentially meant building or configuring one yourself. Combined with Valve's upcoming Steam Machine and Steam Frame hardware, the signal from the supply side matches the signal from the survey data. More companies are now willing to bet actual manufacturing investment on Linux gaming continuing to grow, not just Linux enthusiasts hoping it will. The hardware profile of today's Linux gamer backs up that same story from a different angle. AMD processors power roughly 70% of Linux gaming systems, compared to only about 39% of Steam's general user base, a gap that reflects both the Steam Deck's AMD chip and the broader tendency for Linux-friendly hardware to cluster around AMD's more open driver ecosystem. Linux gamers also skew toward heavier memory configurations. Systems with 32 gigabytes of RAM make up about 33.5% of Linux users, compared to roughly 25% across the wider Steam population, though 16 gigabytes remains the single most common configuration for both groups. Underneath the Steam Deck's dominant share, the broader Linux distribution landscape is more varied than most people assume. SteamOS Hollow, the specific build running on the deck, accounts for about a quarter of all Linux gaming activity, while Arch Linux holds close to 9%, and Linux Mint sits near 7%, with smaller but growing communities running Fedora, CachyOS, Bazzite, and Ubuntu. That spread matters because it shows the growth isn't just people buy a Steam Deck. It's a wider ecosystem gaining users at the same time. Put those two threads together and the market share numbers finally make sense instead of looking like a random blip. In January of 2026, Valve's survey showed Windows 11 at 66.71%, Windows 10 still lingering at 27.79%, and Linux sitting at roughly 3.38%. By March of 2026, Linux had climbed to 5.33%, an all-time high, while Windows as a whole dropped below 93% of Steam's surveyed users for the first time on record. Part of that specific jump was inflated by a data correction involving how simplified Chinese language users were being counted. So it's fair to treat that single month as somewhat overstated rather than purely organic growth. The months after March saw Linux pull back, first to 4.52%, then 3.99%, then 3.69%. A normal correction after an unusually sharp spike. But by July of 2026, Linux climbed back above 4%, reaching 4.01%, with Windows losing 0.43 points in that same month, while Linux gained 0.32. At that share, Valve's own reporting translates to an estimated 5.29 million monthly active Linux users on Steam, and notably, that growth in July wasn't limited to Steam OS and the Steam Deck. Distributions like Fedora, CachyOS, Bazzite, Ubuntu, and Linux Mint all gained ground in the same period, which suggests the trend has started spreading beyond Valve's own hardware into the wider desktop Linux ecosystem. None of this means Linux is close to replacing Windows as the default choice for PC gamers, and anyone claiming that is overselling the story. Windows still commands somewhere around 93 to 94% of Steam's entire audience, an overwhelming majority by any measure. What makes 2026 different from every previous "this is the year of Linux gaming" prediction that never panned out is that the current growth isn't being driven by hope or ideology. It's being driven by three simultaneous measurable pressures. 500 million? Windows 10 machines facing a real support cutoff with no cheap fix, a Windows 11 that spent roughly 4 years visibly prioritizing ads and AI integration over the trust of the people using it, and a Linux gaming stack that, for the first time, actually works well enough for a huge share of the existing game library to make the switch practical rather than symbolic. Whether that growth keeps compounding from here depends on choices neither Valve nor Microsoft has fully made yet. If Microsoft's 2026 pullback on Copilot and Recall genuinely rebuilds trust, rather than just pausing the friction temporarily, some of the pressure driving people toward Linux could ease, since a meaningful share of switchers were reacting to specific grievances rather than pursuing Linux as a goal in itself. If, instead, the AI integrations quietly return. Once the backlash fades, as some users already suspect given how the Copilot rollout unfolded the first time, the erosion of trust likely continues and probably accelerates. On the Linux side, the remaining ray tracing gap and the still unresolved Vanguard and Fortnite anti-cheat cases represent the last major technical excuses left standing. If even one more major anti-cheat provider follows BattleEye and Easy Anti-Cheat's lead, or if NVIDIA's Linux driver investment closes the remaining 10 to 15% performance gap, there won't be many practical arguments left for staying on Windows purely for gaming reasons. Both companies know this, which is exactly why Microsoft is walking back some of its most controversial features, and why Valve is doubling down with new hardware rather than resting on the Steam Deck's success. Valve isn't finished pushing on this either. The company has announced plans to bring back Steam machines in 2026, reviving the console-style concept it first tried and abandoned back in 2013, this time built on more than a decade of Proton maturity instead of an unfinished compatibility layer. Alongside that, Valve is developing the Steam Frame, described as an all-in-one gaming PC running Steam OS, extending the same formula that made the Steam Deck work. Hand someone a complete Linux gaming machine and let them use it without ever needing to think about the operating system underneath. There's a broader legitimacy question sitting underneath all of this that goes beyond gaming specifically, and it helps explain why publishers are more willing to invest in Linux support today than they were 5 years ago. A 2025 survey of software developers found that roughly 27.8% already use Ubuntu for their professional work, alongside meaningful numbers running Debian, Arch, and Fedora. That's a different population than gamers, but it matters for the same reason the Steam Deck matters. When a large share of the people actually building software are already comfortable inside a Linux environment day to day, supporting Linux stops being an exotic request from a tiny hobbyist audience and starts looking like ordinary due diligence. Combine that with a Steam player base now numbering in the millions on Linux specifically, and the calculation for a studio deciding whether to test its next release on Proton or enable an anti-cheat provider's existing Linux support shifts a little further in Linux's favor every quarter. One industry piece covering the July 2026 numbers put it plainly: Linux doesn't need to approach Windows' overall market share to matter, because continued growth alone is enough to push developers toward testing through Proton and supporting SteamOS handhelds as a standard part of launching a new game, not an afterthought reserved for the biggest titles. So why is Windows losing millions of gamers to Linux right now, specifically now, after decades of Linux gaming going nowhere? Because the two conditions that used to keep everyone on Windows by default finally broke at the same time, in the same 18-month window, instead of drifting apart the way they usually had in the past. Windows 11 stopped being an obvious, frictionless upgrade and started asking users to trust a company that had just spent roughly 4 years quietly filling their operating system with ads, unremovable AI features, and a screenshot tool that leaked its own vault to malware, all while forcing a hardware deadline onto 500 million Windows 10 machines with no cheap way out. And Linux, for the first time in its history, stopped requiring a trade-off to use for gaming thanks to a compatibility layer that plays roughly 90% of the existing library. Anti-cheat vendors that finally opened the door even if publishers are still walking through it one game at a time, and a handheld device that turned millions of ordinary players into Linux users without them ever noticing or caring. That's why the number in July 2026 matters more than any single Steam survey usually would. 5.3 million monthly active Linux gamers isn't a symbolic footnote anymore, and it isn't a fluke month inflated by a reporting correction either, since the correction-driven spike happened back in March, and the number has kept climbing again since. It's the visible result of two companies making very different choices at the exact same moment. One spent years testing how much friction, advertising, and forced AI its most loyal users would tolerate before looking elsewhere, and the other spent that same stretch quietly removing every remaining excuse not to leave. Windows isn't losing millions of gamers to Linux because Linux suddenly became perfect. It's losing them because Windows finally gave a large enough group of people an actual reason to check whether the alternative had gotten good enough to matter. And for the first time in Linux's history on the desktop, the honest answer for a huge share of the existing game library turned out to be yes.